Do you know how the rules differ for flying IFR into and out of an airport that doesn't have any instrument approaches, and how those rules differ for Part 91 and Part 135 pilots? And just how would you go about creating your own ODP at an airport like this that doesn't have an ODP? I promise we'll answer those questions and more after the news. Hello, my name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books, and I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week, we talked about the new G7 version of the Cirrus SR-22 and about its new glass cockpit. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/310. And if you're new to this show, take a moment right now, reach down to your phone and touch either the subscribe key or, if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Coming up in the news for the week of January 15th, 2024, Phillips 66 suspends unleaded avgas testing. 3 people were killed in a barn in what appears to be yet another VMC demo accident. And we'll tell you how taking a picture led to an off-airport accident. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, Phillips 66 suspends unleaded avgas testing. Phillips 66 has paused evaluation of its unleaded avgas alternative after what sources have told AvWeb was a major test failure. The oil giant said in a statement to AvWeb, quote, "We can confirm that PAFI evaluation has been paused on the Phillips 66 Afton Chemical 100M unleaded fuel." According to sources with direct knowledge of the issue, the Phillips Afton fuel was powering a Lycoming engine in a test cell on a 150-hour endurance test, and the engine failed due to a buildup of manganese deposits that fouled the spark plugs and or caused pre-ignition. Phillips did not confirm that as the cause of the evaluation pause. The departure of the Phillips Afton entry leaves 3 contenders in the unleaded avgas evaluation. From EAA.org, Guide to Drafting Mosaic MPRM Comment now available. The deadline for submitting comments to the FAA's Mosaic proposal is January 22nd, 2024, so that's coming up quickly. Mosaic builds upon the 20 years of positive experience with sport pilot and light sport aircraft and proposes to broaden the definition of the privileges of both. For example, it would replace the current arbitrary gross weight limit in favor of performance standards and would allow thousands of sport pilots to continue flying familiar aircraft. EAA writes that they'll be submitting their comments, and they encourage EAA members to comment independently on the Mosaic proposal. To support those members drafting comments, they've developed a commenting guide detailing the areas of the proposal that EAA supports and those areas where they're offering constructive recommendations to enhance the FAA's proposal. And we'll include a link to the EAA comments guide in our show notes. From AINonline.com, fatal business jet accidents climb steeply in 2023. 6 accidents involving U.S. registered business jets killed 23 people in 2023 versus 0 fatalities in 2022, according to preliminary statistics gathered by AIN. 5 occurred under Part 91, killing 15, and 1 charter accident accounted for 8 fatalities last year. Interestingly, the number of 2023 fatal accidents and fatalities was identical to those of 2021. For U.S. registered turboprops, the number of non-fatal and fatal accidents changed little over the last 2-year period, but fatalities decreased from 37 in 2022 to 25 last year. All but 1 of the 10 fatal accidents last year involved Part 91 operations. 5 people were killed in a single Part 135 crash in 2023. Runway excursions continue to be the most common type of accident or incident, with 71 recorded by turbine business aircraft last year. Turboprops were involved in 32, of which 12 were classified as accidents. Of the 39 excursions by business jets last year, 16 were classified as accidents, one of which was fatal to all 4 aboard the non-U.S. charter flight. And in a related story, this comes from aviation-safety.net, on Thursday, January 11th, Royal Air Freight Flight RAX 698, Learjet 55, suffered a runway excursion after landing on runway 22 at Mission Field Airport, that's KLVM, in Livingston, Montana. The aircraft sustained substantial damage, and the 2 pilots on board the aircraft were not injured. Runway 22 is a 5,700-foot-long asphalt runway. And from the BostonHerald.com, 3 killed in Western Massachusetts plane crash. 3 people were killed in a plane crash near Greenville, Massachusetts on Sunday afternoon. An FAA spokesman told the Herald that the two-engine Beechcraft Baron 55 crashed around 12:30 p.m. on Sunday. According to the Massachusetts State Police, the victims were identified as a flight school owner, a flight instructor, and a commercially rated pilot, presumably receiving flight instruction. Now, I've looked at the ground track for the aircraft, and it appears that it lost control while doing a VMC maneuver, and I'll talk more about that maneuver and how it leads to accidents during my updates. From themercurynews.com and also from NBCBayArea.com, 4 people killed in a Half Moon Bay plane crash on Sunday. According to the FAA's preliminary report, a Cozy Mark IV home-built aircraft crashed into the ocean near Half Moon Bay Airport in California due to unknown circumstances. The FAA lists the time of the incident at 7:40 p.m. Sunday. Initial reports from local authorities put the crash closer to 7:15 p.m. A caller to authorities on Sunday said that they saw a plane flying, quote, erratically in the area of the Half Moon Bay Airport and the Moss Beast Distillery. They said that the plane's engine sputtered out and the plane had likely gone down. Initially, the FAA listed 2 fatalities, presumably one being the pilot and the other a passenger. But as of Tuesday, investigators now say they believe 4 people were on board, sources tell NBC Bay Area. The pilot was Lochi Ferrier, who graduated from MIT in 2019 with a degree in aerospace engineering. He worked at Magpie Aviation in Hayward, California as a test pilot. Prior to that, he was a test pilot for Beta Technologies in Burlington, Vermont for their eVTOL. Now, I looked at the weather for the times around the crash. At 7:15 p.m., Half Moon Bay Airport was reporting clear and visibility of 8 miles, but at 7:35 p.m. it had dropped to 5 miles with fog and mist. Now, fog and low clouds are common at Half Moon Bay Airport. Also, the airport is surrounded on 3 sides by the ocean, so there are a few lights on the ground, and it's easy to get spatial disorientation there at night. And it can also happen to high-time pilots. The LinkedIn profile for this pilot says that he was a commercial pilot and a CFI for both fixed-wing and helicopters, and that he had attended the National Test Pilot School. From avweb.com, balloon crash kills 4 in Arizona. 4 people died, including the pilot, and 1 is critically injured after a hot air balloon crash in Eloy, Arizona, about halfway between Tucson and Phoenix on Sunday. The balloon, identified on Monday by the NTSB as a Czech Republic-made Kubitschek BB-85, took off with 13 people in the basket, including 8 skydivers. Eloy Police Chief Byron Gwalty said at a news conference that after the skydivers jumped, quote, something catastrophic occurred with the balloon, causing it to crash to the ground. It would appear the skydiver's departure was planned and not in response to problems with the balloon. The mayor, Micah Powell, told reporters that witnesses said the canopy was deflated and the basket hit hard on the ground. 5 people left in the basket included 4 passengers and the pilot. And from Reddit.com comes a possible explanation. It says that the sudden change in the weight of the balloon system, with 4 divers equaling perhaps close to half a ton, the buoyancy changes dramatically and you'll suddenly climb very rapidly in excess of the max climb rate in the POH. This max climb limit exists for precisely this sort of scenario. When you climb rapidly, there is a lot of air now pushing down on the top of the envelope, which can collapse the top of the balloon or even the entire envelope. When that happens, it then causes you to lose a bunch of the hot air providing your lift, and your sudden ascent quickly turns into a sudden descent. So the 2 things that you've got to do in order to be successful and safely drop large amounts of ballast, such as skydivers, you've got to let them go 1 or 2 at a time, but you can also drop them while descending at a rate such that the loss of the ballast will then arrest the descent and leave you level or slightly ascending. And finally, from generalaviationnews.com, landing to take a picture doesn't turn out as planned. This comes from a final NTSB report. It says the pilot and passengers were flying the Aviat aircraft A-1B at a cruise altitude of about 3,500 feet. The pilot told investigators that he performed a precautionary landing for unspecified reasons to a beach on Matagorda Island in Texas. During the landing roll, the airplane veered left and collided with a sand dune. The fuselage and both wings sustained substantial damage. When reporting the accident to his insurance company, the pilot reported that he had landed to take a picture. He did not report any mechanical malfunctions with the aircraft. Probable cause? The pilot's loss of directional control during an intentional off-airport landing. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later we'll talk about flying IFR in and out of airports with no instrument approaches. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. First up, no new certificates or ratings to report, but if you've just passed a check ride, you can let me know about it. The best way to always contact me is to go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. Now, as you know, we're focused on general aviation safety and helping us all become better pilots, and I'd like to suggest that you think about your safety orientation beyond just the cockpit. Now, I think I may have mentioned that I once talked with my neighbor about self-defense, and he said one of the first concepts is to avoid situations where you might need to use self-defense, which makes sense. Along those lines, today I was supposed to be on a Southwest flight to Nashville and then drive 2.5 hours to Knoxville, where I would then spend 2.5 days doing my annual VisionJet recurrent training. These days when I go to Knoxville, I fly into Nashville since it's a nonstop flight, and there are no nonstop flights to Knoxville from my area. And I also try to arrive a day early so that I have time to rest up and get prepared for whatever I'll be doing in Knoxville, which is often meeting a client and helping them fly their new VisionJet or SR-20 or SR-22 home. Now, those are great flights, and we get lots of training in along the way. But yesterday, I got a message from Southwest that the flight might be canceled or delayed. When I checked the weather, I saw that at our arrival time in Nashville, they were expecting freezing rain. And Knoxville was supposed to have rain with temperatures around 2 degrees Celsius. So that 2.5-hour drive to Knoxville would have probably been much longer at best, and in the worst case, extremely dangerous, if not impossible. So, like my neighbor who avoids situations where he needs self-defense, I decided to postpone my flight by a day and spend that extra day that I built in my schedule here at home, finishing up this episode. Plus, I managed to save a day of car rental and hotel, reducing the total costs. So, when you think safety, I'd encourage you to think both inside and outside the cockpit. In a moment, I'll talk more about the Barron accident in Massachusetts that I mentioned during the news, but first let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show and that we have several new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. Just go on out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via either PayPal, Venmo, the Cash App, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks so much for your support. And I want to mention that the FAA has released an update to their advisory circular called Reciprocating Engine Power Loss Accident Prevention and Trend Monitoring. That's AC 20-105C. Prior version was published in 1998. Now, AOPA wrote about the AC, and they said that it highlights several operational causes of engine failure that include inadequate pre-flight inspections, fuel contamination and misfueling, collapsed fuel bladders, exceeding time between overhauls, poor engine operating technique, and maintenance mishandling. Lack of pilot training and mismanagement of the engine control systems by the pilot remain the leading cause of engine failure. In addition to accident prevention, the AC, quote, provides generic data collection charts to assist with setting up a reciprocating engine trend monitoring program to improve and track both engine and related system reliability over the recommended life of the engine. Now, the FAA believes that many power loss accidents are preventable if the owner-operator implements a training program for pilots and mechanics and incorporates an engine trend monitoring program. And of course, I'll include a link to that new AC 20-105C in our show notes. And now let's talk a little more about the Barron 55, that's November 7345 Romeo, that crashed over the weekend in Massachusetts. I mentioned during the news that I looked at the ADSB data for that flight. I also put the data into a simulator so that I could see what a cockpit view might have looked like for the final few minutes. Initially, they did 4 steep turns, then they leveled off at around 3,800 feet, and then decelerated rapidly from a ground speed of about 180 knots to around 115 knots. Then it looks to me like they practiced 2 stalls, one that was fairly docile in pitch, and one that seemed extremely aggressive in the pitch up. Interestingly, there was literally just a second between the time they finished the first stall and the time they began to pitch up again for the second stall. Now, I always allow time between maneuvers to discuss the prior maneuver and make sure everything is stable and that we're ready for the next maneuver if we're doing the same thing. Now, my first instinct when I looked at the flight data was that it was a VMC demonstration, since so many of those go badly. And frankly, I've always felt that the VMC demo is the item that really puts me most at risk when I'm teaching in a twin, which is probably why I was so predisposed to thinking it was a VMC demo. But after looking at it many times, it really looks to me more like a power-on stall. I shared that simulation I created with Tom Turner at the American Bonanza Society, and he had similar conclusions. He wrote, The flight path and airspeed data suggest another possible single-engine stall falling off of an attempted VMC demonstration maneuver. So he had the same initial thought that I had. He continues, these are disappointingly common in barons and travel airs and are exacerbated by an aft center of gravity, such as would be created by carrying an observer in the rear seats. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. He continues, it might also describe a stall on two engines that devolved into a spin, the final maneuver being below the recommended 5,000-foot AGL entry level for a VMC demo, and it included a climb, whereas the VMC demo is entered from level flight. The flight path includes a decelerating climb that's more descriptive of usual techniques for power on stall and well above the recommended 1,500-foot AGL minimum recovery altitude for stalls. Online discussion also focused on strong turbulence reported in the region on the day of the crash, and reasonably expected airframe icing had the Baron, which was not certificated for flight in icing conditions, entered clouds or precipitation while maneuvering. And a few seconds later, he sent a second message that said, I think the flight path looks more like a power on stall or a simulated engine failure after takeoff because of the climb before departure from controlled flight as opposed to the flight level entry in the VMC demo. So Tom's thinking and mine evolved pretty much along similar lines. As I looked at the data, I saw that the ground speed dropped by 40 knots from 100 knots to 60 knots in just 11 seconds. It was associated with a rapid pitch up that averaged around 1,500 feet per minute and briefly reached a climb rate of 2,500 feet per minute. During that time, it gained 450 feet. The entire maneuver lasted just 20 seconds before the nose dropped and the aircraft started heading for the ground. Now, there's no way to tell from the ADS-B data whether a spin occurred, but I think it's likely that one did. Now, let's talk for a moment about why you really don't want more than two people in a twin when you're practicing stall and VMC demos. And I'm sure some flight schools put a third person in the plane so that they can observe and learn from the flight, but I would never do it, and here's why. When you add a third person to a plane, the center of gravity of the airplane shifts aftward toward the back of the plane. That new CG is going to be closer to the rudder than it would be if you had just two people in the plane. And here's the problem. The effectiveness of the rudder is a function of its distance to the plane's center of gravity, because that is the point around which the rudder provides rotation. So when you have an aft CG, you've got a shorter moment arm between the CG and the rudder becomes less effective. And having strong rudder authority is crucial during stall recovery to prevent any initial yawing to the left or the right from developing into a spin. And if the rudder is less effective because you have a third person in the plane, you've just decreased your chances of recovering from an incipient spin. A couple of months ago, I vaguely recall that someone wrote to me to say that there were 3 fatal VMC demo accidents in 2023, and I know that at least one of those accidents had 3 people on board. So if you're giving or receiving multi-engine instruction and you're planning to do stalls or a VMC demo, I strongly encourage you to have just 2 people on board. Also, if you're doing power on stalls in either a single or multi-engine aircraft, I'd encourage you to limit the rate at which you pitch up to about 1 degree per second. Pitching slowly and deliberately like that gives you time to watch the slip skid indicator and gradually add increasing amounts of right rudder throughout the climb. By contrast, if you pitch up rapidly, you probably won't keep up with the need for increasing amounts of right rudder. Then, if you do stall and you're uncoordinated because you pitched up rapidly and didn't have enough right rudder, you're more likely to enter a spin. Now, here's a message that came in from patron supporter Sam Dawson some time ago, and he was writing about a different twin-engine spin stall accident that we talked about here on the show, and he wrote, I think I related to you the near spin I encountered while doing slow flight and stalls with a student in a Piper Seneca. My near spin doing a power-off stall, one engine coughed while the student advanced power below blue line speed, looked almost exactly like this accident. Also, I would be loath to take an additional student in the back while doing VMC, slow flight, and stalls in a twin. He writes, even a single-engine airplane such as a 172 can be legally spun. And just to clarify, that would be the older 172s. The newer ones cannot be legally spun. But not with anyone in the back seat, he writes. I don't know of any twin that is certified for spins, so there is no discussion in any POH on the legal CG for a spin in a multi-engine airplane. But we do know that it is generally easier to recover from a stall spin with a more forward CG versus an aft CG. So Though having a person in the back is perfectly legal while doing slow flight, stalls, and VMC demos in a twin, it may preclude a recovery if a spin is accidentally encountered. There have been several recent crashes recently in this configuration, and it may be something flight schools that conduct twin-engine training may want to revisit to see if the risk is worth the benefit. As always, keep up the good work and keep the dirty side down. Also, I may have mentioned that patron supporter Seth Lake, who we've had on the show multiple times, told me during our phone conversation that he feels that the way the FAA requires the VMC demonstrations be done puts us at greater risk of entering a spin. He has some ideas on how the FAA should revise just how VMC demos should be done, and he's agreed to come on the show to talk about that sometime in the future. Now, aviation is a very small community, so let's take a moment and see if you know any of these people. These are people just like you who listen to the show and find value in it. We have 2 new mega supporters on Patreon. These are the folks that donate more than $50 a month. The first is Travis Wathen. He writes that he's created a nonprofit organization that helps to educate those in the aviation industry about overall health. And I see on the blog page that there are a lot of articles, including ones about fitness, well-being, impact of weather on mental health, balancing family and flight, hydration, and so on. That site is mbs4avi.com, and I'll include a link to that in our show notes. He and his wife are also in the process of creating a school for inner-city youth to train them on the process of building an aircraft. And also thanks to Pilot Life, who is back with us after a hiatus. They offer a digital logbook that you can find at pilotlife.com. Thanks to William Felon, who made a donation via PayPal. And also thanks to these people who donated via Venmo, Jack Hollis and James Ennis. Coming up next, our conversation with Mark Kolber about flying IFR in and out of airports that don't have instrument approaches. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Mark Kolber. He's an aviation attorney and a flight instructor based in North Carolina. He's a frequent contributor to IFR Magazine and pilotworkshops.com. And now here's our conversation with Mark Kolber. Mark, welcome to the show. Great to have you here today.
Great to be here, Max. Thanks for asking me.
So I have read your online writing for many, many years. You've written about instrument flight regulations. Tell me how you happen to become so expert on IFR rules and regulations.
That's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I mean, there are definitely people out there who anoint themselves as experts, but I think really being an expert is mostly about other people's perception rather than your own. I'm actually a latecomer to aviation. I started taking lessons when my wife, who was tired of hearing me talk about how I've wanted to fly since watching Sky King as a kid, bought me 3 lessons for my 38th birthday. She figured it would finally get it out of my system, and now she says she hasn't seen me since. I was already a lawyer. I was dealing with regulations. And so understanding them and accepting the idea that they were subject to interpretation and all that was natural. Plus, I was a trial lawyer, and I always felt the job of a trial lawyer was to be a teacher, to explain. Sometimes we had to explain the law to judges who didn't know the area. We certainly had to explain and tell a story to juries in order so they would understand what was going on, hopefully the way you wanted them to see it. At the same time, I ended up becoming a CFI, and aviation law became a really good fit. I was out of private practice for 10 years. When I came back in, I started doing aviation law work. Instrument flight is really special. 10 to 20% of it is about controlling the airplane, and the other 80 to 90% is all about rules, regulations, and procedures. It's a system which our mistakes may have an immediate impact on other people. And so we really have to know what's going on there. I was also an earlier adopter of technology. So I was in the AvSig groups in CompuServe way back when, the Rec Aviation news groups, and I started answering questions. And, and sometimes I'd have to look it up and sometimes I wouldn't. And honestly, in the years that I've spent in online forums and online groups, I've probably learned as much as I've told people. So I just tried to give reliable information. And for some reason, people started looking at me as if I actually knew what I was talking about. And I guess that's how I became an expert.
Right. And I started reading your work probably back in the 1990s, back in the very early days of the internet. So that's when I became familiar with your work. Now, certainly IFR regulations can be a little confusing, especially when you're starting to get into non-standard cases. Now, the reason we're talking is I was contacted by a listener who flies his plane in and out of Sea Ranch, California, which is a private airport. And he told me that the local HOA there is planning to ban IFR departures because someone told them that it's illegal for a Part 91 pilot who has an IFR clearance from ATC to depart in IMC from an airport with no instrument approach. True or false?
Well, there's actually two questions in there. And one is it legal to depart under instrument flight rules from an airport with no instrument approach? And the second one is, well, under what kind of weather conditions can we depart under IFR? And the answer to the first question is easy. There's nothing in the aviation regulations in Part 91 that prohibits a plain vanilla Part 91 pilot from taking off under IFR from anywhere. You can look as hard as you want and you find it. And in fact, it happens all the time. Let's remember, we didn't always have RNAV approaches, and there were many airports, both public and private, with no approaches, but flight schools where instrument training was still taking place, including mine. I did my instrument training in the early 1990s at an airport with an 1,800-foot runway and no instrument approaches. We not only filed and departed IFR regularly, but we had a number of flights where our takeoff was in pretty marginal conditions. Checking my logbook, one of my last flights before my check ride was 1.8 hours. I needed a lot of work. And 1.5 of that was in actual conditions. So that was going on. I took a look when I knew I was going to be doing this, I took a look at a couple of airports where I suspected those kinds of flights would be made. If you look at 4Flight's Route Advisor or similar displays of clearances issued by ATC, you'll even see them. Mountain Air is a private residential air park in North Carolina, pretty much a resort. It's a resort community. The airplanes which use it include everything from light pistons to Pilatuses to King Airs to Citation jets. Citation jets are always filing IFR. When I looked about a week ago, I figured, well, where are they likely to be coming from and going to? And, being a North Carolina mountain resort, I figured Florida is probably their home base. And so I checked Pompano Airport in Florida, and it showed 13 clearances from Mountain Air to Pompano Beach. I also took a look at Sea Ranch, and I kind of chose Sonoma County as my possible destination from Sea Ranch. And again, there were 17 IFR clearances shown in 4Flight, and a similar amount in flightplan.com, which was doing that kind of stuff long before 4Flight ever existed. So, if this was prohibited, it would be really easy for the FAA to know that people are filing IFR out of airports without instrument approaches. The big regulation on this for Part 91 is 91-175, which is called takeoff and landing under IFR. And I think when we receive our instrument training, we kind of know it as the regulation that has the 10 things we're supposed to memorize about what we must see in order to go down from the MDA or the DA down to the runway. But the regulation has a lot of other stuff. And what's interesting about it is that the rules for landing are far more strict than the rules for departures. So 175A requires us to use instrument approaches if we need instruments to land in an airport. No exceptions. No exceptions that, you can kind of make up your own instrument approach or anything like that. On the other hand, 91-175F is the one that deals with takeoff minimums and obstacle departure procedures. And it starts off by saying this paragraph applies to persons operating an aircraft under Part 121, which is airlines, 125, which is airplanes in power lift over 6,000 pound capacity and greater than 20 seats, 129, which is foreign air carriers, and 121 is our airlines, and 135, which is our charter operators. So that whole thing does not apply to any of us. It means that We can do 0-0 takeoffs. It means that we can not use an ODP if we don't want to. It allows all sorts of things that may not be particularly safe for us to do, but legally we're allowed to do it.
Well, so you brought up safety, and that's a really good point. I suspect, though I don't know for sure, that the HOA thinks that by restricting IFR takeoffs, which they've been led to believe are illegal anyway, somehow this enhances safety. Let's kind of run through that thought process. Suppose you've been told you can't take off IFR. Now you've got to wait till the weather becomes marginal VFR and kind of scud run to take off. Which is going to be safer?
It depends. I mean, the problem with the IFR departure in IMC conditions is that we don't have the FAA's assessment of obstacles for our departure. We have to rely on ourselves. And that is a huge problem. I mean, we have all sorts of tools to allow us to do it. If we have ForeFlight or a lot of VFBs use the FAA's terrain database to give you profiles. Well, the problem with that is that that is kind of the FAA's general stuff about obstacles and terrain. It's the stuff that, gives us the AROCAs, the off-route obstacle clearance altitudes of 1,000 feet above and 2,000 feet above in mountainous terrain. And, that's still a pretty big buffer. It's not taking off when you're a couple of 100 feet above the ground going past some antenna. So that's kind of the safety issue in there. I suppose at some point we can say, hey, I know this airport. I've taken off VFR at this airport 1,000 times, and I know where the obstacles are, and I could just avoid them. And, maybe we can do it and maybe we can't do it. And that kind of gets to one of the legal issues. When I said, there's kind of a maybe floating around in there about what kind of weather conditions. There was a question asked of the FAA chief counsel exactly about our situation back in 2015. And the letter came from Dave Wyman, who people, especially your listeners in the Midwest, might recognize as the man behind Midwest Flyer magazine. Anyway, Dave gave the question directly about, can we make a departure in IMC from an airport with no instrument approaches? Is it safe? And his exact question went, is it safe and legal for a pilot to accept responsibility for obstacle clearance when he cannot see obstacles on the ground, but could likely avoid obstacles due to his knowledge of the area and the charts? The answer was really interesting. There was no reference to any regulation that would prohibit the practice. Instead, the chief counsel's letter pointed to one of our all-time favorite regulations. I always found it interesting that it's 91.13, which is the prohibition of careless and reckless operations. And the letter warns that it may, not is, but may be deemed careless and reckless to answer yes to the ATC question, can you maintain your own obstacle and terrain clearance based upon being likely to avoid obstacles? So that kind of puts us in one of those kind of very gray areas that aviation is famous for, where there's no regulation prohibiting it, but there are safety considerations that, may wind up having the FAA saying this is careless and reckless. And, really the most common version of that is when people start arguing about the 0-0 takeoff. I mean, talk about something that's inherently unsafe, except under very, very special circumstances where you literally can't see anything in front of you and you're relying on your DG or HSI to even maintain your center line on the runway for the takeoff. And there's a lot of that out there.
Yeah, so you brought up a lot of different things here. I want to get back to the ODP assessment the FAA does for instrument approaches in a minute. And we'll talk more about 135 in a minute. But I think one common point of confusion might be that the FAA, I think, has a very different answer for taking off from an airport in, let's say, Class G without a clearance. Now, some pilots might argue, well, I'm in Class G. I could take off without a clearance. But that's going to get them into trouble. And by the way, that's very different from what we've been talking about so far, which is having an IFR clearance. Explain, the ins and outs of taking off in uncontrolled airspace without a clearance.
Well, actually, the taking off in uncontrolled airspace without a clearance is very related to what we're talking about. because it's the exact same kind of analysis of something that is technically legal in the sense that nothing prohibits it, but is one of those areas where the FAA and supported by the NTSB, which wears two hats. One, it wears the investigatory hat for accidents, but it also is the first court that a pilot deals with when the FAA initiates an enforcement action. So there's actually two levels within the NTSB. One is the administrative law judge, who's basically the trial lawyer, the trial judge. And then there's the NTSB that sits as a whole that acts at its own internal court of appeals. And if you still don't like what happens, you go up into the real court system. But there have been cases which have dealt specifically with the question of IFR takeoffs. One is Vance and the other one, I think, is Murphy. And in both of those, you had somebody who took off from Class G, uncontrolled airspace, in instrument conditions, expecting to reach VFR conditions by the time they entered controlled airspace. And in both of those, the FAA went after the pilot, and the NTSB agreed that this was an unsafe practice. And they made a point of saying, and in fact, one of the charges, one of the violations that was charged was a violation of the cloud clearance requirements. And the NTSB said no. They said no. The FAA loses on that point. There is nothing illegal about flying in uncontrolled airspace under IFR. But this is unsafe and reckless because of the impact that it may have on aircraft that are in controlled airspace. You're betting that you're going to reach visual conditions. You're betting there's nobody on an instrument approach back into your airport. There's just too much betting going on for the FAA to be happy. It's interesting because our rules about flight under IFR, if we look through all those regulations, we see that their opening lines are a little bit different. Some say no pilot may under IFR, and other ones say no pilot may under IFR in controlled airspace. So there's a whole body of rules that deal with flight, IFR flight in uncontrolled airspace. The problem is it's completely impractical, at least in the lower 48. And I think even in Alaska, it's true. But at least in the lower 48, I mean, look at what we're looking at. We're looking at a nation in which basically controlled airspace at its lowest, with the exception of some very, very small pockets, begins at 1,200 AGL. If there's instrument approaches anywhere in the area, it's going to be 700 AGL. What are you going to do? How are you going to maintain your required separation from terrain and buildings under 1,200 feet or under 700 feet? So it's really a very impractical thing to say, well, we are allowed to fly IFR in uncontrolled airspace. There just really isn't any place that you can really do that from a practical standpoint.
Yep, different situation from the one we started talking from, but I can understand how people might confuse this situation with that situation. Let's move to Part 135 for a moment. And what's going to be different for someone who's taking off from an airport with no instrument approach, such as Sea Ranch?
Well, one of the things we talk about when we talk about is it legal under Part 91 is, we say, well, there's nothing saying prohibiting it. On the other hand, in 135, there is. If we take a look at 135.215, its very first paragraph says, and I'm going to read it, except as provided in paragraphs B, C, and D of this section, no person may operate an aircraft under IFR outside of controlled airspace or at any airport that does not have an approved standard instrument approach procedure. So there's a direct prohibition for 135. It's actually really, really a strict prohibition. If you read it carefully, you see it really prohibits any Part 135 operations, even at non-towered airports, with approaches where controlled airspace doesn't begin to 700 AGL because you're taking off into uncontrolled airspace, even when there is an instrument procedure, because you're starting out down there. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions because, Part 135 flights fly into 700 AGL controlled airspace airports all the time. And that's where operation specifications come into play. Essentially, op specs are the rules that apply to a specific carrier on certain airplanes. There are some standards for them, but they're essentially a negotiation between the FAA and the operator. And so there are exceptions for routes outside of controlled airspace, which we really don't have very much of those. There's exceptions for instrument. It's actually an exception that allows you to fly the missed approach in uncontrolled airspace if you have an op-spec allowing you to use that airport. So the 135 situation is very different from the Part 91 situation.
Got it. But I guess if we have a Part 135, we can write an op-spec that says, okay, we can take off under these conditions. And if the FAA approves it, then it becomes legal at that point.
I'm going to take an educated guess that that's pretty common. I mean, I spoke with, interesting enough, since you work with Cirrus, I spoke to a Cirrus pilot the other day who's flying a 135 operation out of Greenville, North Carolina, and he came into our airport, which is controlled airspace beginning at 700 AGL. And they do it all the time. This is one of their routes. They fly to us. They fly to Myrtle Beach. They fly regionally. And, sat there talking with the pilot for a while. But the point is they're doing it. And it's done regularly. Otherwise, they'd be limited to Class D, E, B, and C airports.
Now, a couple minutes ago, you talked about the FAA assessments. Those are not done at airports that don't have instrument approaches. So obviously, these airports will not have been evaluated. Explain what that FAA assessment is and what we can get out of that for airports that have had an assessment.
Well, now we get into the the real weeds of TERPs. And one of the things, despite my supposed expertise, that's one thing I always disclaim and say, TERPs is way above my pay grade. But essentially what they're doing is they are doing an assessment, not only the approach, but also of departure procedures. And what they're looking for essentially is, can this airport handle the standard IFR departure? That's the one we all learned when we're doing our instrument training of 35 feet above the departure end of the runway, no turns before 400 AGL, a climb rate of 200 feet per nautical mile. And so they're evaluating obstacles on a very detailed basis. They actually flight check these. They actually fly them to make sure that everything's okay. And they're evaluating those. And if they find that no matter which way you go and which runway you use, you have that kind of clearance, that's what we refer to a diverse departure procedure. Diverse simply meaning not different, but diverse meaning changeable, every direction possible. If they find that there are obstacles penetrating that area, then they make adjustments. So we might have a full-blown ODP, or we might have takeoff minimums that say, look, you're going to have to at least have visibility up to this point in order to do the approach. You might see any combination of things like that. And so we'll get takeoff minimums, we'll get climb rate requirements, we'll get full-blown ODPs in order to compensate for that. Well, if there's no instrument approach to the airport, none of that is being done. So you're really completely on your own as the pilot.
Yeah, and that evaluation is conducted out to 25 miles from the airport in non-mountainous terrain and up to 46 nautical miles away from the airport in mountainous terrain, which I think I've talked with pilots sometimes in the South and the Midwest, and they're like, well, what's this ODP thing you're talking about? Because we've got large areas of the country that are relatively flat. And so those evaluations don't require any ODPs. Tell us kind of just generally, briefly, what is an ODP for airports that have one?
Well, an ODP is let's take it as in steps. What a lot of airports, even in flat areas, have is takeoff minimums. And sometimes the takeoff minimums will include sort of the initial stage of an ODP that says you need to climb to this altitude before making any turns. Okay, and that really is kind of a mini ODP if you really want to think about it that way. I have one right at my home base. We have a tower not far from us that is high enough that we simply refer to it as Scary Tower. They always say, oh, which way is Scary Tower? And if you look at the takeoff minimums for our airport, it actually talks about that if you're going in that direction, don't make any turns from center line until you at least reach 1,000 AGL. So that's kind of our mini thing. When we're talking about an ODP, a full-blown ODP, and sometimes they're in text, sometimes they're charted. I think all the ones that are now RNAV are charted. They are looking for what is the path, what is the precise path that's going to get you out of here without hitting something. And so they do an evaluation to find those locations, and the ODP can be very, very specific in terms of you climb to here, you go here, you take this course, and then you turn around over here, and you go to this VOR, and you enter a holding pattern until you get to the right altitude to be able to take the next step.
And if it's textual ODP, are you going to find that in your GPS navigator, something that you can load and fly?
Not the text ones. The text ones, you're going to have to take a look and see what it says in the alternate minimums and takeoff procedures. It's interesting, though. I looked at one, we talk about the East and all that, but we have our little mountains too. And there are a couple of ODPs that are like that. And I remember taking one and being able to use ForeFlight's ability to create courses from anything to anything. And I actually have put together on that one, I put together a small chart that gives me those directions so I can kind of follow along if I'm flying that ODP.
Sure. And you can also use, for example, the OBS mode in GPS navigators, which we're not going to get into, to do that as well. And I've done that on a number of occasions.
Absolutely.
So how does one go about, in essence, creating their own ODP if you're at an airport that's got some terrain nearby, but there hasn't been an FAA evaluation of your airport?
If I was going to do that, I would use a combination of things. I would use an EFB that incorporates the FAA terrain and obstacle database. And that's going to give me some kind of an idea as to it's going to give me the answers to the first question. Is there anything official that is going to get in the way of my departure? But really, if I was going to be doing it, I think it's really one of those local knowledge things. I mentioned it before, but you're going to take a look. You've flown in and out of the airport before. You're saying, I have an IFR flight coming up. Let me see where I can create a path to get out of here. And sometimes it's not going to be a big deal, but because it's local knowledge, about that tower that they just put up next door to the airport that the FAA hasn't even heard about yet because nobody's reported to them for their obstacle database. That, I think, is probably the closest to a safe departure in marginal or true IMC conditions that you can get from an airport that has not been assessed by the FAA.
And so let's talk about ODPs briefly. If an airport has one, as a Part 91 pilot, am I required to fly it? And what about if I'm a Part 135 pilot?
If you're a 135 pilot, you're required to fly it. That is part of the regulation that in 135 that applies to 121, 135, and all the others. If you're a Part 91 pilot, there's actually two pieces to it. One is, no, we don't have to fly it if we don't want to. If it's really IMC, I'm not sure why we wouldn't want to, but especially looking at some of them, I'm not going to take that chance. So that's part of it. The flip side of it is that it is our absolute prerogative to fly an ODP, even if it's not mentioned in our clearance. Now, the one exception to those is if the FAA, if ATC, for example, assigns an ODP, well, now it's part of our clearance, so we have to fly it then. The other one is there are substitutes for an ODP. SIDs, if the airport has a SID, a standard instrument departure, those are also assessed for obstacle and terrain clearance. So if we assign a SID, then we would fly the SID instead of the ODP. And the SID, and most of those are going to be ones where radar contact is low enough that ATC can guide us once we get to a certain altitude.
What about private airports that might not be in the FAA's database? How would you file to and from one of those airports?
Well, that's one of the issues. Now, that doesn't apply to Sea Ranch. Well, actually, it may because it's helpful because Sea Ranch has an identifier. So if it has an identifier, you can at least file. In fact, I tried to file. I took one of our airports that is nearby, that is a private airport, And I said, oh, where can I go from here to someplace else? And I actually filed IFR. I canceled it eventually, but the computer took it just fine. The practical issue might be that unless it's one that's being used regularly, ATC might not know what you're talking about, because I don't think that their computers have that are ATC computers. I don't mean the center one, but your local TRACON or local center area necessarily knows where that airport is. It wasn't IFR, but it was a VFR flight where I was going to actually that Mountain Air Airport in the mountains of North Carolina. And, I said, I'm going to Mountain Air 5NC0. And they go, we don't know what that is. And so what I did was I chose someplace nearby. What I would do is at the point of the clearance, first of all, if ATC says, oh, no problem, we know exactly what you're doing, great. If not, I would have a backup of at least being able to say it's a location off of such and such radio. If you're taking off under visual conditions, it becomes a little easier. You can just pick an airport that's nearby, and that's your departure for your IFR flight. And so you open up in the air and you say, I'm now 5 miles from that airport at such and such altitude. I want to open up my IFR flight plan.
Got it. Now, is it possible to file to and from a lat-long coordinate?
You could. I mean, if there's nothing in there, you have an area off of some farmer's field somewhere where it doesn't even have an identifier, then you can do it from a lat-long coordinate.
Okay, we've talked a lot about getting out of these airports. So let's talk about getting into them. Suppose we have filed IFR to an airport with no instrument approach. What are the requirements? What's different for Part 91 pilots?
The only thing, as I mentioned earlier, that the rules about getting down are much more strict than the rules about getting up. And essentially, we'd have to be able to get low enough to be in visual conditions to get to the airport. And in terms of just filing to them IFR, my very first IFR flight after getting my rating was a two-way trip. And one was departing IFR from my 1,800-foot runway with no instrument approaches out to Islip, Long Island. But the next day was the return trip. And the return trip was also in a lot of IFR where and coming back to my home destination. And one of the rules is no matter what the weather is, it could be clear in a million. But if you are going IFR and your destination does not have an instrument approach, you must file an alternate. That 1, 2, 3 rule doesn't apply there. It's 1, 2, 3, or it's an airport with no instrument approaches. So I had to do that. And I was an IMC fairly close to it. And in terms of location, this little airport is right on the edge of the Bradley, Connecticut Class Charlie airspace. So I'm dealing at that point at that point, it's the olden days. It was the ARSA rather than Class Charlie. But I'm dealing with Bradley approach, and they're getting me down to their minimum vectoring altitudes to the point where I can say, I can see my home base and I can take it from here. And then they let me go, and there I was.
Yep. So definitely have to have an alternate anytime we're going to an airport with no instrument approach.
Definitely.
Now, here's an interesting corner question. That's something that people probably wouldn't usually think to do. Can we file an airport that has no instrument approach as our alternate? Could we use Sea Ranch as an alternate if we're flying into Sonoma County?
We can. But the thing about alternates is that in order to use an airport that does not have an instrument approach as an alternate, you have to expect that the weather reports are showing that you will be able to get from the MEA, from the minimum altitude, down to Sea Ranch in VFR conditions.
Well, we have covered a lot of territory here today. Any other kind of final thoughts about flying in and out of airports that don't have instrument approaches?
I think the biggest issue is for us is that, we have to really consider what kind of, and this is the non-regulatory piece, we have to really consider what kind of conditions we're willing to do it in and what kind of risks we're willing to take for ourselves. And if we have passengers, for our family, for our friends, we don't have to worry about paying passengers because that's going to be Part 135 and they can't do it. But that's really what it's all about. It's really a personal assessment of, is this safe? Is there a way to do it safely? What are my minimums? I mean, many of us won't take off from a a Class Bravo airport when the weather is below the ability to get back in. We do that then too. And here we have just so much more that is going to be on our own plate in terms of our personal safety.
Mark, this has been great. Can we have you back again sometime soon to talk about instrument flying?
Absolutely. Anytime. I enjoyed this greatly.
Yeah, my thanks to Mark for joining us here today. You can read more of his work in IFR Magazine and at pilotworkshops.com. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your silence may be sliding upside down.